musicians, more technical people.
Can't be that Magdalene is the only technical person. Then he goes away and we all panic.
Is that okay? No? You probably can't hear me. I know you can. It is working, isn't it? Don't worry about it. I'm quite happy not being there.
Because then Tracy will say, nothing happens when we're not there.
I'm sure you can find an old video of something like Billy Graham or something like that, and then it kind of was it with the new faces? You could put my head on it or something like that, like you know, kind of yeah. Okay. That's it, like you kind of like it, right? You know. That's it. Oh, so yeah, today's theme is the God who speaks silently, and we will be looking at the book of Esther in a minute. And, I remember when I was young, I don't know how young I was, but I must have been pretty young. And I remember my mum saying, "I'll see you next year." Obviously, it was New Year's Eve. I was too young to have any concept of what that meant. It just seemed a long, long time. And I remember bursting into tears. It's what you have, some memories stick, don't they? Like, you know, it's kind of, I was thinking, you know, how some things happen to us and we kind of remember them, you know. And even now I can still remember that. And it's a horrific thing that I'm not going to see it again for another year, whatever a year meant. You know, kind of have no concept of that either. But obviously, our experience with God, there's times when God is just kind of amazing, and we feel God's touch all the time, and other times when we just don't. I often think about, I know a lot of people, I don't want to destroy this, but a lot of people like the poem about footprints. You know, when Jesus looked back, and there was two sets of footprints, and then the person goes to God and says, "Look, yeah, but when I was going through really bad times, there's just one." And then God says, "Yeah, that was the time I carried you." I think that's good up to a point, but my problem with that is, yeah, but I didn't. That's fine in hindsight, but that's not how I was feeling at the time when I was going through a really hard time. When I was going through a bad time, I wanted to know that you were carrying me. I didn't want to feel abandoned. I didn't want to feel let down. I didn't want to feel is that you weren't listening to me. So while I can see where the poem has come from, there's a struggle that I would have. Obviously, there are times, it could be because we've been ill. It could be because we're going through a period of doubt. Loads of reasons why we pray and there doesn't seem any answers. We pray and it doesn't seem as if God is even listening to us. And we kind of struggle on. And most of us, at some stage in our lives, will have felt that or are feeling that now. It'd be so much easier if I said, "Oh, God, I've got a problem with this issue." Or, you know, there's this verse in the Bible that I don't quite understand, and I don't quite see it the way everyone else sees it. You know, just give me the answer now. But it doesn't work like that. And we have to struggle through. Or sometimes we think, yeah, I'm going through a really hard time. If I just pray now, and God will say, "Yeah, okay, you're sorted." But it doesn't happen like that. The book of Esther is an interesting book. As Mim said, she's robbed off my talk, but there's only 2 books in the Bible that are actually attributed to a woman, which is, which there's probably loads of reasons for this, but whatever you see, there's only 2, Book of Ruth and Book of Esther. In the Book of Esther, there is no mention of God at all. There is no mention of any people praying at all. There is no mention of any prophecies at all. It's a story in the Bible, and in fact, I did read somewhere that actually it's probably one of the latest books, if not the last book, not to have a Bible study or one of those ones that goes through the Bible, Bible study book or something. That's it. Because people will think, well, what do we do with this? There was a bit of gnashing and ripping and clothes off in frustration. There was fasting, but it doesn't actually say that fasting was because of prayer or anything. But somehow, through the story, we can see the hand of God, even though there's no mention of God in any way at all. Those who've read the Book of Esther, if you have never read the Book of Esther, it's worth a read. It's about 12 chapters, and if you imagine they were going to do it as a soap opera or a series of things, then it would be a classic. Because you could leave each bit in people hanging to want to watch the next bit. So I'll do as potted a version I can. The trouble is when you do a trailer, you get the things in the wrong order, and because you just make it sound better. So I'm going to try and do it, but I recommend you reading the Book of Esther. It's a good read, but it's a... Anyway, there's a few main characters. There's Xerxes, he's the king. There's Haman, well, he's the kind of, he probably said wrong, but I'll call him Haman, because there used to be a Liverpool player called Haman, I can see that way. But Haman, now he's the baddie. And there's Mordecai, who's the goodie, and Esther. They are the main characters in the story. The story has lots of interesting bits. There is possible genocide. There is hatred. There is people who manipulate situations. There are people who just misuse people. There are so many things that are in it which are just really, really interesting, which a lot of time could be part of human life. But basically, Xerxes is the king in Persia. And I won't tell you all this, but basically he decides that his present queen isn't doing exactly what she should do because she's not obeying him. So he decides to go for another queen. And so he looks around and he chooses this woman, young girl, called Esther. Now Esther and her uncle, I think the Jewish people had been taken into slavery into Persia. Now, no one knew that Esther was from the Jewish faith. And so she kept that quiet, as did Mordecai, her uncle, who looked after her. Anyway, she's chosen to go before the king for him to choose out of all these women who was going to be the one that was going to be, his next queen. Not that he got rid of the other queens and things, but she was going to be the one at the time. And Esther is chosen. Now Mordecai obviously loves his granddaughter, whatever relative, and sits outside the palace to keep an eye on making sure she's okay. Now Mordecai one day hears that 2 guards talking, and they are going to try and kill the king. So he gets a message through to Esther and says, tell the king that the people are going to try and murder you. And so the people are found, and Mordecai is praised by the king, and it's all right. Haman is one of those people. Have you ever seen the Aladdin? Have you ever seen the story of Aladdin? Especially on the advisor to the king or the pharaoh or whatever, the person in, the woman's, the princess's dad, whoever that person was, is like a bit snivelly and kind of sneaky and kind of, manipulates the situation to his own. Well, he's a bit like that. And he gets himself in a situation where, he's trusted by the king. And he puts this thing out that if a man walks past you, you should bow your head to him, because he's very important. Mordecai refuses to do that. And Haman doesn't like that. And Mordecai is going to get him, he's going to kill him. But his hatred for him so much that he not only is going to kill him, he's going to kill all the Jews in that area. He wants to wipe them all out. Mordecai sends a message to Esther because he finds out about this. And he says, you need to do something. You need to do something because this is what's going to happen. We're all going to be, this date in a few months' time, we're all going to get wiped out. And Esther sends a message back saying, well, I'm out of favour with the king. It's just a few months later, and the king is kind of, looking round other women type thing, because he can do that and all that, And I can't just approach the king. To just approach the king without his permission, and I can be killed. He says, you've got to do something about it. And surely, maybe this is your time. You've been called for this moment. And so she decides to try and do something. And so she fasts. And she gets herself all made up and, dolled up, lots of perfume on and things like that. And she stands in the courtyard. And the king looks out. And he remembers how beautiful Esther is. So he calls her in. And he said, what would you like for me to do? Even for half your kingdom, I can give it to you. And he said, let me do a banquet for you tomorrow. He said, okay. And he goes to the banquet. Then the next day, he said, I'd like to have a banquet tomorrow. So he said, that's fine, I'll come. The night before the banquet, Haman has arranged for a 70-foot gallows to kill Mordecai. That night, the king is in bed. He can't sleep. So he asked for someone to bring a book of some of the past records of what's happened to him during his life. And the book is chosen, and it becomes the one where it records a position that Mordecai actually was involved in saving his life, and he'd forgotten all about it and hadn't rewarded him at all. So the next day, just before the banquet, Esther's there, a man comes in, and the king goes to the man and said, what should I do? Because what would you do for someone that who's done you a great service and I've forgotten all about it, and they really need something off me in appreciation of, and he said, oh, give them half your kingdom and all that, because he thought it was him. And then he said, oh yeah, go and see Mordecai. He's the person. A man obviously is mad at this time. But before he does that, Esther, the king goes up to Esther. And Esther says this. The king says, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It'll be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it'll be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Who is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." So not only now has he found out that Mordecai saved his life, and he remembered it, he now finds out Haman has been doing things behind his back and wants to exterminate all the Jewish people. The king is mad, and he walks out raging that Haman could have let him down. Esther is sitting on a couch, and the man, in desperation, knowing that he's going to be in trouble with the king, throws himself at Queen Esther, pleading for his life. The king comes in, misreads the situation, and can only see Haman, this person he's found out is not as good as he thought he was, is attacking his queen. And so the gallows is given over to Haman, and he's hung instead. And then Mordecai is put in a position where he then goes and stops all the genocide that was likely to happen. That is a brief summary of, Esther knows this book a lot more than me. Emma knows this book a lot more than me, so she'd probably say that was all in the wrong order. But yeah, but that's basically the thing. It's an interesting story. It's a good read. But you think, oh, yeah, but where was God? But then, in a sense, we could say that God was there through it all. Even through the possible genocide, even through the misuse of human beings, even in all the things that went on in the story, God was there, maybe in the background, doing things. The book, the Paradox book, talks about God like as a director. In a film, you don't see the director. But you know that the director's hand when you see the film, because the way it's been done. So you could recognize a Steven Spielberg. He's probably the only person I know. You could recognize one of his films because of what goes on, the way he does things and things. Somehow God is involved in this story, even though there is no mention of him at all. And I suppose for ourselves is that many times we do pray to God and there isn't an answer. We cry out and it doesn't feel as if God is there. And somehow we've got to cling on to the sign actually that God is at work. God's hand is in it, even though we cannot feel it. But the trouble is, if you're like me, I want to feel it. And somehow I tend to trust actually that God is there in the pain, in the suffering. Some people say that it's part of God's sovereign will that we should go through times like this. I'm not convinced by that. I'm sure that God doesn't make me go through bad situations. That God doesn't say, right, Alan, you need to sort this out, so I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to listen to any of your prayers. I don't think God does that. Some people say it's our own fault because we're not listening to God. And the reason that God's not answering our prayers is because we're just not listening. Or it's not that we're not listening, we're not obeying him. Or if you're not obeying him, well, you haven't got enough faith. So it's your faith lacking. Well, none of that is true. Paul, who, I think most people would say that St. Paul was probably, quite a person of faith. He prayed 3 times for what he calls a thorn in the flesh. Something that we're not too sure what it was, but there's something about an illness he had or a disability he had. 3 times he prayed, and it never went away. Can't say it was the person, Paul's lack of faith. And we have Jesus in the garden the night before he died, praying that if this cup of suffering can be taken away, then please let it be so. We can't say Jesus didn't have faith. We couldn't say Jesus wasn't obeying God. But he felt deserted at that point, alone at that point. So in many ways, part of the Christian journey, part of our Christian life, will be that there could be times when this happens. Times when we just got to sort things out. We can't sort things out. Times when prayer just seems so hard, or we pray and we get no answers, or don't seem to get any answers. But somehow, the book of Esther is an important book. And the reason maybe it's in the Bible is because it shows that there is a God behind the story, even though God's name is not mentioned. That people aren't seen to be praying, that people aren't seen to be following him. That God is still at work. God's hand is still there. So the paradox revolves around a God who speaks even in silence. That God continues to work in our lives even when we're not aware of it, even when it doesn't feel like it. I'd like to think about maybe it's like a tree. A tree that's in drought has to have its roots going deeper and deeper and deeper to looking for that moisture. Or the roots have got to go wider and wider and wider depending where they are, trying to look for that moisture. And so maybe in these times that we go through are times when our faith can grow deeper and deeper and deeper, or wider and wider and wider. And we never see a tree and its roots grow because it's hidden. And we don't always see God at work in our lives. But we know, or we can know, that those roots of faith can continue to grow. That our trust in God can continue, even in the silence. So whatever we're going through now in our lives, whether it's good, bad, indifferent, whether we feel God close or not, whether we feel our answers to prayer or not, it's good to know that God is still working in our lives, in our situation, even though we may not feel it. We're going to pray, just have a couple of minutes of listening to a Taizé prayer. It's basically just repetitive song that goes through, "O Lord, hear my prayer." And maybe for ourselves, we can pray for ourselves if we're going through times, or for other people that we know are going through a tough time in their life for whatever reason.